Will Jeff Okudah return in week 3 to exact his revenge on his former team, the Detroit Lions?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by PrizePicks. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL or use code in all lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. And guys, if you don't know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, your very humble host. Formerly covered the Falcons for many years over at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong here on this illustrious podcast. You may also know me as Sirius Black, Mr. Holier Than Thou, and Mr. Drew. My friends call me Negative Nancy, but you can call me Mr. Drew. But you can become one of my friends by becoming an everydayer of this illustrious podcast, making it your first listen, first watch. And all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So this is a bonus extra episode that I'm recording Wednesday night. You're probably hearing this Thursday afternoon, in addition to the normal crossover that we recorded with Matt Derry of Locked On Lions. And I told you earlier this week, I got a chance to talk with Brad Spielberger of Pro Football Focus about the Falcons 2-0 start, and we'll get to that conversation at the end of today's episode. But I kind of wanted to take a little bit of a deeper look into the Jeff Okudah, Cordarrelle Patterson potential returns in week 3 against the Lions. We kind of only touched on it briefly in the crossover with Matt Derry on yesterday or today or whenever you're listening to this podcast. So let's get into that, right? As far as, again, recording this Wednesday night, both Jeff Okudah and Cordarrelle Patterson were full participants in practice on Wednesday. Patterson wasn't even technically on the injury report, so that means he's pretty much good to go. And, as I think I noted in that crossover, we've seen this trend now with Patterson and Mike Hughes. When they missed a chunk of the summer, there was like a 2-week ramp up period for those guys fully participating in practice, which is why I believe that we will see Cordarrelle Patterson play this weekend against the Detroit Lions, but probably not Jeff Okudah. Now, let's look at that timeline with Mike Hughes and Cordarrelle Patterson. They were first reported to miss practice with their reported soft tissue injuries way back on August 13th. We later learned that Hughes' soft tissue issue was a hip flexor. Patterson was dealing with a thigh injury. And then we saw Hughes' first full practice back was the Wednesday before week 1, so September 6th, and Patterson's was last Wednesday, so September 13th. So in that case, Hughes missed about 24 days of practice. Patterson missed 31 days of practice. Now, Hughes practiced fully for the entire week 1, but was a healthy scratch against the Panthers. Then he got another full week of practice in week 2, and we did see him play against the Packers. Patterson's first practice week, we saw him last week be a healthy scratch, and this week we are assuming he'll also get another full week of practice, which again, based off of this precedent and this pattern, puts him on track to play against the Lions. So clearly the pattern is, with these guys missing as much time as they did during the summer, there's kind of a 2-week ramp up period for those guys. Now let's look how that applies to Jeff Okudah. He got injured on, I think, August 5th. And while we did see him return on a limited basis in practice on September 13th, that basically means he missed 39 days of practice, and basically, a week more than what Patterson had and 2 weeks more than what Hughes had. So theoretically, that could mean that the ramp up process for Jeff Okudah could be a little bit longer than the 2 week, theoretically, right? So it's possible that Okudah could practice every day this week as well as next week and still not suit up for the Jaguars. But more importantly, I do not expect Jeff Okudah to play this weekend against the Lions. I could be wrong on that, right? I did get the Packers prediction wrong. And, based off of that, that probably means, though, it's probably going to be like another year before I get anything wrong. So humble. I'm joking, guys. But, I think it's unlikely that we'll see Jeff Okudah in this Lions game. I think it's more likely that we'll see him in the London game against the Jaguars in week 4, but it's even possible that we might not see him then, and they may wait another week because of the prolonged absence that he had compared to Hughes and Patterson, and we might not see him till week 5 against the Texans. Who knows at this point in time? So to recap, I think it's very likely we see Cordarrelle Patterson get his first action against the Lions this weekend. I think it's unlikely that we're going to see Jeff Okudah against the Lions this weekend. I think at best it's probably a coin flip at this time, so we'll see about that. But maybe the revenge game element increases the chances we see Okudah at an earlier timeline than what we saw with Patterson and Hughes, or maybe it decreases it because they don't want to necessarily have him too amped up and ready to go. So we'll see. So if Okudah is out for another week, does that mean the Falcons are going to roll with Tre Flowers or possibly Mike Hughes as that starting cornerback opposite AJ Terrell this weekend against the Detroit Lions? And which is their best option? We'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So we are sponsored by PrizePicks, who have a fun and quick way of playing daily fantasy. It's simple. Just pick 2 or more players, and based off of their projections, you're not going up against other people. It's just their projections. You pick more or less on their projected stats. It's quick, it's easy, and you can win up to 25 times your money. The more entries you put in, the more money you can win back, and you can get that money back quick. And, the Bijan projections keep going up each week as he outperforms them. This week, 70.5 rushing yards, more or less, 99.5 rushing and receiving yards combined, more or less. And, if you feel like, hey, I'll go more on Bijan, maybe you double up by going less on Tyler Allgeier's projections. Whatever you want to do, have fun with it. It's all why PrizePicks is the #1 daily fantasy sports app. And to play, you can enter by going to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use the code LockedOnNFL in lowercase for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and promo code LockedOnNFL. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Now, Jase Medical provides us with the Jase case, which includes 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. And you're probably wondering, why would I need to stock up on antibiotics? I can just go to the doctor. But, we live in a hectic world, guys, right? You never know when the next supply chain shortage or natural disasters or pandemic is going to hit. You don't want to be stuck without access to these potentially life-saving medications. And so it doesn't hurt to be more prepared now than ever. And I know personally, I deal with sinus infections, ear infections a bunch, and Jase Medical makes getting access to these antibiotics simple, easy. Fill out a simple online form, and you get those potentially life-saving medications sent directly to your door. Everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected, and you can save more than $360 by getting these life-saving medications from Jase Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using the code LOCKEDON at checkout at jasemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com, promo code LOCKED ON. So the question is, should the Falcons bench Tre Flowers this week? And I think if you're asking, should they do it? I think the answer is yes. Will they do it? Probably not. Now, as I noted earlier this week, Arthur Smith did give Tre Flowers, a vote of confidence when he was asked about his performance against the Packers. I don't know how meaningful that is, because we've seen a pretty consistent pattern with Arthur Smith. He doesn't throw his players under the bus. He doesn't even throw former players on the team that aren't currently on the roster under the bus, right? When anybody was asking him questions about what he thought about this year's team being better than his previous year's team, he would never even acknowledge that reality that he had better players on this year's team than he had on previous years, right? He would never say, oh, this year's team is better. He would basically say this year's team is different, right? We all know that this year's team is better, right? But he wouldn't even acknowledge it. He's like the dad. It's like, oh, I love my kids equally, right? I don't love one more than the other. I just love them in different ways. That's kind of what Arthur Smith is. So, I think basically I say that because I think it's going to take a lot before Arthur Smith throws a player under the bus and does not give that player a vote of confidence when asked about him. So that vote of confidence, basically I'm saying, probably should take it with a grain of salt. However, I do think it's notable that I do think we can say with some degree of confidence that the leash is shorter on Tre Flowers, because we did see him get pulled for a single play last week, right? Now it was one play, one snap, right, to close out a drive. But I think that's pretty meaningful, right? Certainly more meaningful than anything Arthur Smith says post-game, vote of confidence or no. And one of the things we noted on the All-22 this week, against last week's opponent, the Packers, the Green Bay seemingly made that halftime adjustment to go after Flowers whenever they saw the Falcons in man coverage. And my concern is future opponents like Detroit are not going to wait till halftime to make that adjustment. They're going to do that from, Jump Street. And I don't expect the Falcons to try to hide Tre Flowers by going away from the man coverage. I know after week 1, I said it was going to be a while before we broke down the coverages on our all 22 breakdowns and whatnot. And, that doesn't really apply to man versus zone. It's more me trying to understand the nuances of what different zone coverages are, primarily cover 6. The Falcons have not really played any cover 6 over the last, what, 4 years. 4 years that I've been charting the defense. I can count on one hand how many. So I'm not as familiar with that. And I've been reaching out. People have been helping. Shout out to that person. You know who you are, who helped me on that. But I can say with some degree of confidence is if it's man or zone, right? It's just the variations of the different zone coverage that have been giving me some trouble with the charting this year. And week 2 was a little bit easier than week 1 because I think the Falcons were a lot more basic in what they were doing. But based off my charting so far, the Falcons have been playing man coverage 64% of the time versus zone coverage 36% of the time. Now, I doubt the Falcons maintain that rate of man coverage for the rest of the year. That number is almost certainly going to dip closer to 50% and possibly even below 50% by year's end. But you got to remember, even if it gets down to like 45%, right? That's still relatively high comparatively speaking in the NFL, right? The average NFL team, according to certain, depending on who you ask, but we'll go with Sports Info Solutions because that was the first thing I saw when I Googled it. The average rate of man coverage last year in the NFL league-wide was 34%. So again, 45% is significantly higher than what the league average would be. And certainly 64% is nearly double what the league average would be. So for that reason, I think it's clear that the Falcons are a man-first defense, right? And because of that, I do think Mike Hughes would give them a better specific matchup in this Lions game than Tre Flowers would be, right? Because I think the Lions have more smaller, quicker receivers, Amon-Ra St. Brown being most prominent of him. I know he's not necessarily a guarantee to play this weekend due to his injury, toe injury or whatever it is. But the difficulty, I think, with the Lions receivers, even if he doesn't play, Khalif Raymond, his likely replacement, is a really fast guy. The Lions move their receivers all around. Like Amon-Ra St. Brown used to be like a slot only guy, but now he's about 50-50 slot versus outside. Marvin Jones is their big wide receiver, and he would be the guy that you would probably prefer Tre Flowers going up against, given the size and physicality. But they move Marvin Jones all around the formation, so it's not easy to match up with the Lions receivers because they're always moving these guys around. And when if it was simply Marvin Jones is parked on on the outside, then I could make the case Tre Flowers would be the better matchup against him specifically. But because they're constantly moving all these guys around, you may get a lot more of Tre Flowers versus Josh Reynolds or St. Brown or Khalif Raymond than you do Marvin Jones. And, I think Tre Flowers is decent against size, but when you get these smaller, quicker guys that, can move, he really struggles against those guys, right? He doesn't have great change of direction. He doesn't have great technique or anything like that. And we've seen that give him problems time and time again, not only in the summer. We're not even counting the Tyreek Hill rep, that went viral on Twitter. Like, that's Tyreek Hill. We know that. Like, that doesn't count. But like, Romeo Dobbs is giving you trouble. Samori Toure is giving you trouble. Like, not everybody's Tyreek Hill. You know what I'm saying? So, and I say all this not to throw Tre Flowers under the bus, right? Because I think Tre Flowers has a role with the team. I think the team has a vision for Tre Flowers, and that vision is as a dime defender that matches up against tight ends, right? You got to remember Tre Flowers was a safety in college. Now, he got drafted by the Seahawks, and they tried to convert him into an outside corner. It did not take, right? And they wound up cutting him after 3 or 4 years. Then Cincinnati picked him up and basically turned him into this tight end eraser in their dime defense. And he worked a lot better as a part-time player than rather a full-time outside corner, right? And I think that's exactly what the Falcons intend for Tre Flowers. I hope that's what the Falcons intend for Tre Flowers. I think you should learn from a good defense like the Bengals versus a bad defense. No offense to the Seahawks, right? But those years when Tre Flowers was there were not great years for them defensively, and so you're like, oh, we can do it better in Seattle. Like, I don't think that's what the Falcons are doing. Not to mention Tre Flowers is also a very good special teams player. So even if he isn't contributing regularly on defense, he can still contribute to this team each and every Sunday. But in order for Tre Flowers to play this dime role, you need Jeff Okudah, right? Now, as we wait for Jeff Okudah to come back, I think in the meantime, it makes sense to me to play Mike Hughes, right? The point I'm trying to make is I don't think it's Tre Flowers' fault that he's struggling. I think he's basically been square pegged as something that he has proven over the course of, basically 6 years in the NFL that he is not an outside corner, right? But I get why the Falcons try to fit this square peg into a round hole, right? Because they like to play a lot of man coverage. They like to play a lot of press man coverage. And Tre Flowers with his size, his length, you like that a little bit better than some of the smaller corners that the Falcons have, besides AJ Terrell. But I think that experiment, it's done. I think the leash should be shorter. I think it's time to turn to Mike Hughes. I think he matches up a little bit better. And if we have 1 week of Mike Hughes, I think he's going to be much more likely to give you league average starting play, because that's what Mike Hughes was in his one full season as a starting outside corner in Kansas City back in 2021. He basically gave them league average starting cornerback play, right? And I think that's worthwhile for the 1, possibly 2 weeks that we might need that until Jeff Okudah comes back. So I'm not trying to sit here and say, oh, Mike Hughes is going to be this massive upgrade, but I think he can give you at least something closer to league average. I don't think Tre Flowers is going to give you that, right? So we'll see how that goes, right? Maybe the Falcons start Tre Flowers short leash. If the Lions go after him early and he's struggling, you pull him for Mike Hughes, or, you just sort of see how long that goes before. But I think the Falcons, the leash is shorter, and the Falcons, if they're not completely ready to bench Tre Flowers going into week 3, they should be ready to potentially pull the plug, at some point in this game, right? If he continues to be the sort of the weak link in the chain, right? The chain is only as strong as your weakest link. And I think Tre Flowers has shown over these 2 games that he is the weak link in what the Falcons want to do schematically on defense. Now, it doesn't mean that he's going to always be that. Again, once Jeff Okudah comes back, now we can start to get Tre Flowers, because I think Tre Flowers is a better fit covering those tight ends than Richie Grant or Jalen Hawkins as that dime safety, personally. So we'll see how that goes for Tre Flowers. He's still very salvageable in a very specific role. I'm just saying, I think the role the Falcons have him in is not that role, but we'll see how that goes, right? We'll talk more about the Falcons, who certainly don't look like a weak link in the NFC with their 2-0 start. So we'll get into a conversation with Brad Spielberger of PFF to wrap up today's episode, look at some of the PFF grades, add some additional context to the Falcons' hot start this year. We'll talk about Ritter. We'll talk about Bijan. We'll talk about the offensive line. We'll talk about the defense. All that coming up to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So we here in Atlanta believe in positionless football, and Bird Dogs is the Bijan Robinson of clothes. It's the versatile. It looks good in any formation for any occasion, right? Whether you want to use them as swim trunks at the beach, you want to head to the gym, you want to lounge around the house, or you can use them on date night, whatever you want. It's the incredibly versatile product of stretch khaki shorts designed to fit slimmer, because they invented a cloud knit fabric that looks like khaki but stretches to give you that slimmer fit without having to sacrifice movement. And they use anti-stink sweat wicking fabric that's going to keep you cool and dry all day long as you go positionless in life. So go to birddogs.com/lockedonnfl or enter the promo code LockedOnNFL at checkout for a free Bird Dogs water bottle with your order. That's birddogs.com/lockedonnfl for a free water bottle at checkout. You won't want to take your Bird Dogs off. We promise you. All right, everyone, welcome back to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast with an illustrious guest, none other than Brad Spielberger, the cap guru over at PFF. You could also check out his stuff over at Over the Cap. Brad's been on with us several times this offseason talking about the Falcons, and now the Falcons have gotten off to this 2-0 start. So, Brad, what are your thoughts on the Falcons' I don't know if I would say hot start to the season, because it hasn't been the prettiest 2-0 start compared to some of the other teams, but certainly I think performing above a lot of people's expectations.
I think particularly on the defensive side, I was a bit of a doubter. Not that they would get better on defense, but maybe to what degree they would get better on defense. And obviously, going up against a rookie debut Bryce Young and I don't know, fifth start for Jordan Love. But nevertheless, the Packers look good in week one against the Chicago Bears. And you have David Onyemata is balling out right now. Jesse Bates, obviously. Three turnovers at this point. Caden Ellis has been kind of that Swiss Army knife we saw to close the season in New Orleans. Ryan Nielsen clearly knew what he had in him coming over. So I think that's the most encouraging thing for me is we'll see the step up in competition. We'll see how they do against better offensive units. But things are translatable. It's not all fluky. They're playing very good on defense. And obviously, the Bijan Robinson show is enough so far on offense.
Yeah, you mentioned some of those defensive pickups, and it does feel like a lot of the guys that they signed, Jesse Bates, David Onyemata, Caden Ellis, Calais Campbell's probably not to the degree of those guys, but we've seen him make some impact plays against the run. So it does feel like the Falcons' money was well spent this off season. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, Onyemata, I think in particular, you got a little bit of a discount maybe just because he had the suspension last year, kind of a down year for him even when he did return. And now you look through 2 weeks, he's our second highest graded interior defender behind only Chris Jones. He's second in pass rush win rate behind only Chris Jones. And I want to say he's top 5 in defensive stops and tackles for loss against the run as well. Certainly up there in those metrics. So he's been exceptional. Ellis as well too. It's he's an interesting one. He basically did not play throughout his entire rookie deal until the last 7 or 8 games last season when Pete Werner went down with an injury. And I think when you look at scenarios like that, the Saints have an awesome linebacker core, right? Demario Davis is still one of the best doing it. Pete Werner is a very good player. They've had some other pieces over the last couple of years. So it shouldn't be a glaring red flag of why was this guy not playing? He's a 7th round pick in a really good depth chart. So he's been awesome too. The deal obviously, was a little bit big coming out, but if he plays like this, the deal is a bargain. And lastly, obviously you spend top of market for Jesse Bates, but 2 interceptions, a forced fumble, has allowed, I think 4 receptions on the year. No less than, I think 1 or 2 receptions on the year. You're getting your money's worth on that one as well.
Absolutely. Now, let's flip over to the offensive side of the ball. Noted PFF has Desmond Ridder tied with Bryce Young for the most turnover-worthy passes in the league through 2 games with 5. Any insights that you can share on that front?
Yeah. So, just in terms of the actual metric itself, the biggest example obviously is going to be, dropped interceptions, right? We obviously want to grade the same fashion. Whether or not a DB makes the play shouldn't really, be indicative of, the interception happened or it didn't. Yes, but the throw could have been picked off. There's been a couple of those. I think underrated in that stat as well is sometimes a sack or potential forced fumble, even if it was a fumble that was recovered by the offense. And off the top of my head, I'm not sure that's happened, but just, as an example, that also would fall into turnover-worthy plays. And so you might see that and say, well, I haven't seen that many bad passes, but that would fall into that category as well. Look, when he's been asked to throw downfield, it hasn't been particularly pretty as of yet. I do think in week 2 against a good Green Bay Packers defense, you saw some more comfort. I think you also saw him trust his legs a little more and escape the pocket. And also, obviously, they've been designing some runs for him. I think the process is slowing down a little bit. It's getting better. Well, he needs more time. But yeah, it hasn't been a pretty start, out of the gate.
Yeah. Now, one player who has gotten off to a great start is Bijan Robinson. And last time we talked, Brad, in the preseason, we talked about how Bijan's elusiveness and his ability to make guys miss in college is translating pretty well in the preseason to the pros. It looks like it's translating pretty well in the regular season as well. I think that was fully on display against the Packers. Any additional thoughts on Bijan's start this year?
I think the great thing with him is not only as a runner, we're going to see highlights of him, making cuts in the hole and making guys look silly every single week. But, it's not just that he's a good pass catcher, can run good routes, all those things. You think about the screen pass that he had for a touchdown, he immediately made a guy miss, right? It's so hard, I think, even for receivers. We see, focus drops where they're already thinking about the first move they're going to make once they catch the ball and they don't catch the ball. His ability to haul it in and then immediately be able to make a cut, make a shift, make guys miss. It's as good as any running back I think we've seen, in a while. It's already Christian McCaffrey-esque, et cetera. So, yeah, he's been as advertised. I think he's already comfortably a top 5 running back in the NFL.
Yeah. Now, speaking more about the Falcons offense, their offensive line has not gotten off to the greatest start. It seems like it's a repeat of what we kind of saw last year where they were one of the best run blocking units in the NFL, but left a lot to be desired in terms of pass protections. Any additional insights you can add there?
So again, I think you look at the opponent. Carolina, maybe not a loaded front all the way across the board, but Brian Burns is a very good player, and Derek Brown, quietly, I think last year ascended into, this is why this guy was a top 10 pick. He really had his way with Lindstrom on a couple reps in that game, in pass pro in particular. But like you said, they're obviously going to, clear massive rushing lanes. They are, predicated on that being the value add. I think they'll get better over time. I think it all kind of folds into the offense. Also, just working more and more with Desmond Ridder as well. I think that will improve. It has been great, but I think it will get better as time goes on. It's a good unit, and obviously they're very good at what Arthur Smith really cares about and wants to pay for. So it'll all come in time.
I agree with that. But any additional thoughts on this Falcons team through 2 games?
Yeah, I think, mentioning kind of the strength of opponent and that as well, like it's one thing if they would have barely beaten the Carolina Panthers by a field goal, right? Like it was a resounding, like clear victory. They could have maybe scored some more points or whatnot, but it's good to, when people start, making excuses or schedule adjusting, which, to a degree is fair. But like for the Eagles last year, for example, I think going into the playoffs, a lot of people were saying their strength of schedule was the easiest in the NFL. We had it as the easiest in the NFL, which is true, which matters, but they weren't winning 1-score games. They were blowing teams out of the building. So it's like, yeah, they're playing bad teams, but they're also destroying them in these games. That matters. That's meaningful. And Green Bay does not fall in that bucket. I also would say, too, Green Bay, great defensive line as well. And you're down 12 points in that game, right? You had to come from behind, which when your team is predicated on running the ball, has a quarterback that's learning the game, that's going to be the biggest struggle, is making come from behind wins. And they were able to accomplish it against a good defense. So, I think there are a lot of positives to take from through week 2.
Absolutely. So, Brad, appreciate your time here to provide some additional insights from the folks over at Pro Football Focus. Let the people know, some of the stuff that you're working on and what they can look forward to this year.
Yeah, Falcons fans are going to love an article I have dropping tomorrow. It's looking at the biggest impact additions in free agency so far through 2 weeks. I think there's 9 total players, and 3 of them are Atlanta Falcons. We covered a couple of them today, so check that out. Some more of the stats and everything behind these great defensive additions. And you can follow me on Twitter at PFF_Brad.
Absolutely. So, guys, wrapping up today's episode. Appreciate Brad Spielberger for his insights into these Atlanta Falcons. And of course, tomorrow we should be joined by Jarvis Davis to get some keys to victory and talk more about this Lions matchup and whatever silliness me and Jarvis get into at the end of the week. You guys know it. You love it. Some of you guys don't like it. I'm entertained by it. I hope you guys are entertained by it. I think the people that love the Jarvis, I was going to use third person, mine and Jarvis episodes, enjoy them thoroughly. So I think they outweigh the people that hate it. But that's in store for you on tomorrow's episode. And make sure you check out the subtext, right? I know this week we did not post any Twitter clips for the All 22 review, but the subtext subscribers did get an extended All 22 review where I broke down several of Desmond Ridder's good plays in the fourth quarter, as well as breaking down some of my issues with the red zone play calling. Getting that visual medium. And of course, if you want to get access to the subtext, you can just hit the link in the description below. You'll get access to the week 1, week 2 extended All 22 reviews. You'll get all the extended All 22 reviews moving further in perpetuity. Other features, I'm thinking about putting together a reel of Matt Bergeron's first 2 games as well. So that will be another subtext exclusive, but it's also great to just get feedback from you, me, get my thoughts on various things that aren't necessarily worth, a whole podcast that I can send out in one text message. You can ask specific questions that you want and get that one-on-one communication between me and you. If you just want to tell dad jokes to me or whatever, hey, I ain't against it. And, subtext is $4.99 a month, but first 2 weeks are free. So 14-day free trial. Basically try it, give it a try. If you like it, keep it. If you don't, hey, keep it moving. I don't know. Anyway, guys, that's going to do it for us here. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. If you want to join the subtext, link in the description below. Appreciate you guys. For your second listen, make sure you check out the Locked On NFL podcast. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.